Hey, thanks for watching Slice of SciFi. I'm Noah Richmond,
And I'm Lewis Howley.
talking today about the Eternals. This would be the MCU directorial debut of Chloe Zhao, a director who's had a bit of a name on the indie film scene. Somebody I have to admit I haven't seen any of myself, but I think Lewis, you can maybe speak to her and her work a little more than me.
Yes, I first discovered her through a film that was one of the National Board of Review's top 10 indies called The Writer. And that was set among indigenous people who were raising horses for rodeo. And then I saw her first film. The title somewhat eludes me. I want to say it was something like Songs My Brothers Taught Me. And of course, I saw her Academy Award winning film Nomadland with Frances McDormand as the star, and for which she won both Best Picture and Best Director. And those were all fairly minimalist, almost cinema verite films. So this film is quite a jump. I read an article in the Arizona Republic in which she said that storytelling is storytelling. But I have to admit that I did not see many touches of her earlier work in this film.
Hmm.
It's, yeah.
Okay, well, so I think what I was curious about. So this film, The Eternals. I'll start off by saying, as far as anything that we've seen in the way of MCU movies, it's definitely unique. I certainly have not seen any other entry in the MCU that's quite like this. It's very long, it's very melancholy, and not a lot of joke cracking throughout the way. And but the other thing is, when we were discussing it before the film, something that you were saying, Lewis, was that um, Chloe's films, the previous ones, had this sort of drifting quality. Like, they weren't really tight narrative films. They were more go with it, somewhat slice of life. It was almost like she just had a camera and just was on the Lakota Sioux reservation, just recording what was going on. Um, Although at the same time there was a story to it, as I recall. Like, it was a story, but it was mixed with just bringing general actors on. So because you told me that, they gave me a little more of a framework for how to approach the Eternals, which I thought had a very similar quality. It was definitely a film that you watch as a sensory experience, in some ways. Um, it was very much a good film for us to have seen on IMAX, because it's extremely visual. She really draws on a lot of cultural references from different parts of the world in different points in time. Because the main characters are quote unquote Eternals, they have been throughout a wide swath of thousands of years of human history, and so the film sort of takes you from one period and jumps you from this period to that period to the other period, and it evokes it in a way that's um, very rich, very dynamically um, sensory experience, um, but it's not very focused in terms of really trying to tell you a tightly narrative story. Um, so I took that as, okay, this must be what it is to watch one of her films to somebody that hasn't seen them before. Um, do
Like,
you think that that's an accurate statement?
I would say that sounds right. I mean, I guess I was caught up by the fact that there was indeed an origin story for the Eternals and the Deviants that leads the film. And we do get to see them go through different time periods. And so I guess I focused more on that narrative. And then when we would shift to present day, which they did, we should point out that the film does intercut between historical periods and the present day. So in some sense, you're seeing flashback when we see some things. And but I think your observation is very keen. It was one that I did not really sense about that. But I guess I was more concerned with the fact of how this narrative would end up and at some of the unfulfilled expectations of the storytelling that came out to me.
Hmm. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I wondered, first of all, with these historical references, I mean, there's one to Babylon, there's one to Tenochtitlan, and there's another one to Hiroshima. And while they do give dates, I had to wonder to myself, how many people in the audience even know these historical reference points? For me, Hiroshima was not that long after my birth, so I mean, I grew up with that consciousness. But I mean, if I hadn't studied history, I might not know anything about Babylon or Tenochtitlan. So I wondered about that, since there wasn't really exposition going on in those scenes about where those places were. In some sense, it could almost have been equivalent to saying the planet Megara or something like that, for some people. And so I wondered about that, just as a thought exercise. What is it? What is this? How does that resonate with the audience? But when we describe the Hiroshima sequence, I found that a very powerful sensory experience, mainly because there were the absence of any humans and just the two Eternals who were visible in the scene after the destruction had occurred. Um, and I was very intrigued by the fact about the Eternals being essentially AI that were created by Erisham, and the Deviants as well were essentially the evil AI, if you want to put it that way. And I feel like when this subject comes up, it's almost as if we're afraid to examine what this means for human beings. Are we essentially AI? Because certainly we share some characteristics, with the Eternals, if nothing else, let alone with some of the AI that we ourselves create. But the line of going over and saying, oh, maybe we're AI too, that was created by somebody. It's almost as if that's undiscussable, and so I found that interesting. And we didn't get to go into much of the AI implications, other than eventually one of the deviants gets a conscience by touching an Eternal, and, what does that mean to become a self aware AI? We see it play out in the movie's Tale, but we don't really have any kind of philosophical discussion about it. And then there's the issue of the Eternals. Since they were supposed, there's a conundrum between supposedly they're not supposed to interfere in human affairs, and yet they're giving humans technology every 2 seconds. And I found that very odd, like a real problem with the storyline. And because where do you draw that line then? You know, and why does only one of the AI, Ajax, know about the ultimate plan of Erisham for the planet Earth? Why don't they all know it? Is he afraid they'll go defective? I find that seemed odd to me. And then why would she tell Icarus 500 years ago, finally, that this was the ultimate plan? It's almost as if you can't trust the AI you create to not break down when confronted with this mission that they're supposed to do. And so that struck me as odd as well, and And most of this was, of course, after seeing the film. It didn't occur during the film necessarily, as I'm just trying to absorb the storyline. But those were all issues for me with the plot. And then the overarching one is that so we've had Thanos and we've had half the human population wiped out and then returned, which they reference in this film. So we know they're part of that MCU universe. And yet all of it is meaningless because ultimately it's Arishem who has the final say over Earth. And everything else the Avengers and Thor and everyone else are doing, and even Thanos, it's just like, oh well, you know, it all doesn't matter because we have the final plan for Earth. And so it's like some kind of meta thing that overshadows the entire existing MCU for me. And I found that troubling.
So I'm hearing you finding a lot of issues like that you had once after you were done watching it and you had some time to think, sit with it and kind of steep with it. Are you just sort of listing out things that bothered you but you liked it overall, or are you actually saying that as a film, this, when you really think it through and you look back at it, you're saying, you know what, that just wasn't a good film because these things were real issues that needed to be addressed and they weren't?
Well, I would say the film is quite entertaining. I don't think that's an issue. I thought the effects were very, very good. I particularly liked the spacecraft of the Eternals on Earth. It reminded me a lot of, because of its geometricness, the monolith in 2001: A Space Odyssey and the obelisk on the Led Zeppelin Presence album. And and that has those things are iconic to me. They're things that I grew up with, and so that did evoke that for me. And the storyline goes along well enough, but in the end, it's like you think about it, and it's like, so I would say it's definitely a film worth going to see, if nothing else, to keep up with the MCU. But it's just, and part of it may be that my bachelor's is in philosophy, and so I tend to maybe overanalyze things a little bit, and of course when you get down to things like the origin of life and those kinds of things, it's very appealing to me to go deeper, and try to parse it out. But so, but I think, for it's certainly thought provoking, as you can see from my discussion. I will be interested to see as it goes on, since there's clearly going to be a sequel. Where it goes and how it'll further mesh with everything else in the MCU. Now that this particular episode has been averted. Will the rest of the MCU even know that this event with the volcano occurred? Will that be referenced? That's a good thing to find out.
Hmm. Yeah, myself, my experience of the film, as I said, I took a cue from what you had told me about expectations from this director and what her directing style was. And so I found myself able to somewhat relax and just go with the ride of it. Again, particularly seeing it on a nice large IMAX screen with, the big booming sound system. And I was able to enjoy it as just the experience of sitting back and taking it in. But as a story, it certainly, it's a very strange thing to say this is the new entry in the MCU because it's just so unlike what Marvel tends to do. And on one hand, that's wonderful. My complaint has been that I feel like Marvel had become, after the Avengers, just had realized, hey, we've hit on a formula. We can insert jokes every 3 minutes and make all of our make everything we churn out to be like kind of lighthearted half comedies, and that was something that I felt tends to be a problem with these Marvel Universe movies. So I appreciated that there was actually some real thought and budget put into making like a genuine big budget indie film that didn't throw a lot of that in there. And I was prepared for it's not going to be a super tight narrative. Just sort of go with what the director is doing viscerally, as it were. But I can't help, having said all that, I definitely walked away from it feeling sad, and I don't know that I appreciated that in the end. Like it was sort of, there was something a little, just generally a bit down about the film. I mean, I guess it's more melancholy than down, but still, it's not the fun, new, spiffy Marvel comic experience that I think a lot of people are going in expecting that they'll come out having had. You're not coming out of it having had a real good time. The other thing is the characters themselves are not. You don't really grow to love them somehow. Like there's something that never fully engages you in terms of really feeling like there's some rapport and like, oh yeah, I really, I really want to run out and buy my Rocket and Groot T-shirt or something like that. Like,
good point.
Like there's just something cold in the end. I don't know that any of these characters is something that people are really going to be fans of and love and care about. And so in the end, I come out of it like, well, I didn't not like it. I mean, I think I enjoyed watching it, although I wish it was maybe like an hour shorter than it turned out to be. But I wouldn't entirely say I liked it either. It's sort of, it's not so much that I disliked it, and it's not so much that I liked it. Really, more than anything, I just found it weird. Like it's a weird movie for Marvel to put out and say this is the next MCU film. Because what it's doing is just so completely unlike the rest of what's in their universe, and in a way I applaud them for that. But on the other hand, you didn't really come out of it really feeling entertained, like you had a really good time. So I'm a little mixed and not entirely sure how to critique this experience.
Well, I will say too that I'm going to address kind of the elephant in the room about this movie, which is the gay kiss and the fact that there's a gay relationship that shows up. I was reading this week in The Advocate that apparently a group of people were so appalled at this that they went en masse onto IMDb and gave this film a rating of 1 over and over and over, such that IMDb had to turn that feature off for this film. And then I read this morning that it's already been banned in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar for those scenes. And of course, that's very sad, that this occurred. And I did not really notice it. Maybe I didn't notice the reaction, But when they kissed, I did not really hear an audience reaction to that. If anything, it was positive. And,
I actually did hear a gasp from a family in the row behind us.
and then, and it reminded me, the reaction that apparently happened at IMDb reminded me of 1982 when I went to see the movie Making Love, which was about a man who was in a heterosexual relationship who discovers that he's gay and ends up in a gay relationship. And there, two men kissed. And I can remember the entire theater practically grossing out, going, ooh, over it. And I thought to myself, did any of you read this plot before you came to this movie? And, because they seem so, viscerally appalled by it. So I want to give Marvel credit for, being willing to take a chance. Obviously, there will be elements that will dislike the film because of it. But I want to say that's another good issue, that here you have creatures that are essentially AI created by Arishem that have sex, because Icarus and Circe have sex. And a really actually very nicely done sex scene, I thought, without being too explicit, but it was definitely very sensual, you know.
But considering that, again, this is where we come back to the whole question of this being a weird thing for it to be the new MCU entry.
True.
MCU tends to be maybe PG-13, maybe not 100% family friendly, but it is something that overall is like families come to. And for what it is, that's a pretty graphic sex scene. It's not quite R-rated, but it's as close as you can come before you get an R rating.
Yeah, I would say that's accurate between Icarus and Circe. That was another interesting feature for me because when I went to the IMDb credit listing, it turns out that a lot of these characters that we have pretty standard spellings in English for these characters from the Greek, admittedly transliterated to begin with. But Icarus is spelled Icarus, and in the IMDb credits it's Ikaris, and Circe, which is Circe, usually is Sersi, and I'm like, why? It's just to make us pretend that they don't have like Greek origins. And Athena is Thena, they drop the A. Is there a point to that?
Well, I mean, they are adapting the comic book, and that is what that is how those characters are called in the comic. But,
so I guess that goes.
Now, why Jack Kirby did that in the comic is a big question.
Yeah, maybe he thought he would be sued by ancient mythology. I don't know, but I will say there were some nice touches of humor with the character Kingo and his sidekick, whose name I forget, who was always bringing out one camera after another. And so I found that to be kind of interesting and humorous. That appealed to me, and I like the idea too of Droid retreating to the Amazon. So there are definitely facets of the film that are intriguing. I will say I was never bored by it. That's for sure. It kept going continuously, and there wasn't a scene where I thought, "Oh, can we just be done with this?" So I was grateful for that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, anyway, I think overall, I would say my thoughts on the Eternals were, I did enjoy seeing it in the theater. I did enjoy seeing it on a big screen. And if it sounds like the sort of thing that might interest you, I would say this is a good one to catch on the big screen if you're going to go for that kind of an experience. But on the other hand, I am a bit mixed on it because it's it's not your typical Marvel film with you come out of it with feeling kind of joyous and uplifted, and it's just strange. The story is very strange, and the characters are interesting, but somehow not compelling.
Yes, I would say I too enjoyed it, and I think it's definitely worth seeing because of its thought-provoking nature. Uh, Even if I wish they had gone farther with some things than they were willing to do, and I would agree that the characters are not well developed, and I think that's partly due to the fact that they're spread out over so many centuries that you don't really get to see them develop very much because they always seem the same in whatever era they're in, and so they almost are one dimensional across the eras. Um, and so if I gave it a rating, I would probably give it a rating of a 3, which is right in the middle. Uh, you know, um, but but I do give MCU credit or Marvel credit and Disney for being willing to insert a gay character because that's been a real issue for them, where they've been afraid to do it. And when I reviewed Jungle Cruise, there was a gay character in that movie, but they didn't use the word gay, because or that have the character even say he liked men. He used a phrase like, "Oh, my interests lie in another direction," was how he referred to it. And I thought to myself, really, Disney, in this day and age, he can't just say he likes men. And so this was much better in that regard.
Yeah, I think I'm 3 is pretty much right about where I would come down as well. I mean, it's sort of weird because in some ways 3.5 is closer to my experience of watching the film and having some enjoyment of just the experience of it. But really, in terms of what did I think of the story and what did I think of how they built it and the cosmology, then I overall, and again, it's just a weird one to rate because it's just, my real rating of the film is it's just strange. uh, but I think I would go with 3 as well. So,
And one last comment I'll make is, of all the MCU characters, I thought if these Eternals were on Earth and were doing their thing with this final goal in mind, then why doesn't Doctor Strange know about it? See, that bugged me.
good point. Anyway, I think that is our thoughts on the Eternals movie, and thank you for watching Slice of SciFi.
Bye.